Okay, now we have a variable that holds the value of the current MAC address. So we finished the first step and we finished the second step. And all we have to do now is check if the value in this variable is the same as the MAC that the user entered as an argument. If it is, then the program did its job and the MAC did change. Otherwise, we're gonna say, sorry, we couldn't change the MAC. Now these two steps are actually really easy and you should be able to implement them using what we learned so far. I will be doing that in the next lecture, but for now I want to spend time doing some housekeeping and clean up our code. Because if we look at the code here, even though we split it into two steps to make it easy to write, the end result is it gives us the current MAC address. So it'll be nice if we can move all of this code into a function that literally just returns the current MAC address. Then we'll be able to print that at the start of the program and show the user that your current MAC address is this, and then when they change it, we can print it again and tell them, look, the MAC address got changed. Also, if we have this in a function, this will mean that we'll have a function that returns the MAC address for us, and in the future, if we write any programs that require us to be able to read the MAC address, then we already have the function ready for that. So let's do that in this lecture, and then in the next lecture we'll finish up our algorithm and validate if the MAC address did actually change. So the first step of cleaning our code, now even if we look at the result that we're getting, we are printing the result of ifconfig. We were doing that to make sure that this variable right here, ifconfig result, has the right value after executing this function, because we never used this function before. So there is no need for this print statement right here. So I'm going to delete it. And I'm just going to bring that up one step. And then I'm going to cut all of this because, like I said, this code right here is only responsible for returning the current MAC address for me. So it does one function that would be handy to be able to reuse that function. That's why we're going to put it in a function. So I'm going to cut this. And I'm going to create a new function here. And I'm going to call this function getCurrentMac. And as you know, we need to have an interface to get its MAC. So obviously this function will need to take a variable for the interface. And then I'm going to go down and paste all the code in here. Now this code is all fine. There's only a few tweaks that we need to make since this is a function now. The first thing that we need to do is the check output in here. We're using options.interface to access the value for interface. Now obviously options is a variable that's used in the main program, so it's not accessible for this function. Therefore, we're passing the interface as you can see here, so whenever we call this function, the getCurrentMac, whenever we call it from here, we're going to be passing the interface as well. So as far as this function is concerned, the interface value is stored in the interface variable here, not in options.interface. So we need to delete this, and that's it, done. Now we have the code for the function, but like we said before, we're not calling the function anywhere. So if we don't call the function anywhere, the code in the function will never be executed. So in order to get the current MAC, we'll need to call this function in here. So we're going to say get current MAC, and we're going to be passing options.interface because the user is going to give us the interface as an argument. We're going to capture it using the options and pass it in here the same way that we used to pass it to the change MAC function. Now, when we execute our Python program, it's going to get the arguments. It's going to execute getCurrentMac, pass it the interface from the arguments. GetCurrentMac will be executed. It will execute all of this code. And if it gets the MAC address, it's going to print it on screen. If it doesn't, it'll print could not read MAC address. Now, we actually don't want to print the MAC on screen. We want to be able to have the MAC here so we can use an if statement and check if this MAC is the same as the MAC that the user entered in the argument. So in order to be able to capture the value for the MAC in here, we will have to return it instead of printing it on screen. So instead of doing print in here, I'm going to delete that and I'm going to say return. my MAC address. And I'm just going to remove the brackets from here so that we return MAC address.search result. And I just have an extra space here. I'm going to remove that and we're good. Now, when this function is called here and everything is okay, it's going to return the MAC address to the main program or to the line where it was called. Now we need to capture that in a variable. So let's just call that variable current MAC. So we're doing current MAC equals get current MAC for the interface. Now let's make sure that current MAC has the right value. So let's just print a statement that gives the current MAC. So we're just going to say current MAC is equal to current MAC. So we're just using a normal append that I showed you before. All we're doing is just using a plus in the print statement, which will append that to the string here. I will also move this to the start of the program actually. So I'm going to move this before changing the MAC so that every time we execute the program, the first thing that we'll do is print the current MAC. So let's go and test out our program. We're going to test this with ETH0. So this is an interface that actually has a MAC. And as you can see, we're getting a message giving us the current MAC. So that's perfect. Now let's run it with LO, which is an interface that does not have a MAC. Now, we first got the error message, which is could not read MAC address, which is returned by our function in here, or printed by our function. But we have an error in here, and this error is returned by Python, not by us. And like I said, it's a good idea to start learning how to debug these issues and know what's happening. So you can see that the error is happening at line 37. And the problem is it's telling us that cannot concatenate str and non-type. And I'll explain this to you. So we have line 37 here. And what's happening is it's trying to print current MAC is equal to the current MAC in here. Now this current MAC variable is capturing the result that's returned by the getCurrentMac function, which is this one. Now, we know that when our code is being executed, we are not reaching this line because we see this message. We see this message being printed, which is saying could not read MAC address, which basically means that whatever code we have here is not able to read the MAC address for us. Therefore, when this function is finishing executing, it has nothing to return. So you can see that if we get a MAC address, we're going to return the value of the MAC address. But if we don't have a value for the MAC address, we're only printing that we could not read the MAC address and the function is exiting. Now when the function exits here, we're trying to capture a variable in here in current MAC. Since the function has nothing to return, it's returning an object called none, which basically means nothing. It's a non-type. So when we are trying to print this, when we're trying to say current MAC is equal to the value stored in current MAC, the value stored in current MAC is not text. So Python does not know how to print this because it's telling me that this is a non-type. This is nothing. I can't just print nothing. So what we need to do, we need to tell Python, whatever value you get in here, I want you to treat it as a string. Even if you get nothing, if you get an object, anything that you get, I want you to print it to me as string, as a text. Now to do that is very easy in Python. All we have to do is just type str before the variable name and put the variable between two brackets. Now this idea of printing something as something else or treating a variable as another type is called casting in programming. So what we're doing right now is we're telling Python that whatever value that the current MAC has, I want you to treat it as a string. So if this function is successful and is able to get me the MAC address, we know the MAC address is already going to be a string anyway, so this will work fine. Otherwise, we're not going to get anything, so the function is going to return none, but I'm telling you, treat this non-object as a string. Now the result, when we go and run our code with LO, you'll see that it's going to give me first of all the message that says could not read MAC address, and then when we try to print the MAC address, it's just going to say MAC address is equals to none. It's equal to nothing. And then when we run it with ETH0, as you can see, we have the MAC address here, which is stored in the current MAC address variable. So that's it for this lecture. I just wanted to refactor our code so we have a function to get the current MAC. This is very handy for us so we can use it in the future anytime we need to be able to get the MAC address. Also, it makes our code prettier and easier to read, and it also allows us to use the function multiple times within the code. So you can see we're already using the function in here just to print the current MAC. And then later on in the next two lectures, we're actually going to get the current MAC again, and we're going to check if the current MAC got changed to the MAC that the user requested. So if we didn't do this, then we would have had to use this code twice in the program. First, to just print the current MAC, and second, to use it to validate if the MAC got changed.